In this aircraft for Mill, we'll be looking at the LaGG-3 Series 29. So to get started, here are some brief notes which you can pause the video and take a moment to look at. Starting off in the cockpit, the canopy is open, and I'll just close it to reduce the noise. So we'll start at our lower left and work our way around. This wheel is our aileron trim, is our controls for the two-stage supercharger. Pushing it forward is stage 2, pulling it back is stage 1. Below that we have our two radiator controls. The upper one is our water radiator. Pushing it forward opens it, and pulling it back closes it. And underneath our water radiator we have the oil radiator, and the same deal, pushing it forward opens it, and pulling it back closes it. Now we have our elevator and rudder trim, and our gear up and down buttons. Now we can look at our main engine controls. The top lever is our mixture, pulling it back is fully rich, and forward is fully lean. Next to mixture we have throttle control. Pushing it forward increases manifold pressure, and pulling the throttle back decreases manifold pressure. Next we have the control to set our RPM. Pushing it forward will increase our RPM, and pulling it back will decrease our RPM. Now we can take a look at the main instrument panel. We have our flaps degrees indicator on the left there. That goes from 0 to 60 degrees. Down the bottom we have our two flaps controls. The left side is flaps up, and the right side is flaps down. The gauge with the yellow circle is our fuel gauge, measured in litres. Above that we have our clock, and to the right of the clock we have our airspeed indicator in kilometres per hour, and we have our altimeter in metres and kilometres. Down the bottom we have the landing gear indicator. When the lights are green, the gear is down and locked. When it's blank, it's in transition, and when it's red, the gear is up and locked. There you can see the compass. Underneath the compass we have the turn and bank indicator. Next to that we have our vertical speed indicator. And above that we find two important engine gauges. The first is our manifold pressure, and then above that we can find the tachometer. Next we have three gauges in one. The highest is oil temperature, and then we have oil pressure on the left and fuel pressure on the right. And then finally we have water temperature. Now we've gone through the important components of the cockpit, we can look at engine start. To start up the LaGG-3, we set our throttle to idle, RPM control is fully back, mixture is fully rich, our water and oil radiators are both closed, and then we just press E to start the engine. Alright, the engine started, so now we're ready to taxi. We open the canopy. We lean out our mixture, and we push our RPM lever all the way forward, and we keep the radiator shut because it's cold outside. And before moving we check our path is clear, and we apply some throttle and we get rolling. Okay, taxiing to the runway takes a few minutes, so we'll skip that and move to the takeoff. Alright, so we're on the runway and preparing for takeoff. We keep our throttle at idle, we make sure both of our radiators are open, we put our mixture to fully rich, keep our RPM control fully forward, and if you're going to use flaps you can deploy them about 20 degrees, and we'll increase our throttle to maximum and rotate at 190 km an hour. We're going to experience torque in the lag as we increase the throttle, so we want to do it gradually. So we start increasing our throttle slowly, and the nose will get pulled to the right with the torque, so then we apply left rudder to bring the nose straight. The throttle's increasing, keeping ourselves straight on the runway using the rudder, bringing the tail up slightly, start increasing airspeed, adding a touch of right aileron, and then we'll rotate at 190 km per hour. Now we're airborne and speed's increasing to about 250 km per hour. We can raise the gear, close the canopy, retract the flaps, and then we can lean out our mixture. We'll be re-entering the circuit, so we're going to reduce our throttle slightly and turn on to downwind so we don't gain too much airspeed. As we come under downwind, we'll look at the landing checklist. We set RPM to 2600 and we adjust throttle as required. Make sure both radiators are closed because we're running at reduced throttle. We'll also drop our gear to ensure we have enough drag to bring our speed down to 250 km per hour, which will allow us to deploy the flaps 20 degrees by the start of base leg. We turn on base when we see the runway at 45 degrees between the wing and the tail. And then once we hit the base leg, we'll be starting our descent, and we can add extra flaps as required. And we also turn on final as required, so line up on centre line with an approach speed of 200 to 220 km per hour and a touchdown speed of 170 km per hour. Start of downwind, and we dropped our gear and closed our radiators. Progressing on downwind, look out to the left, ensure the runway is under the wingtip for our circuit altitude, and that way we know we're a good distance away. As our speed starts reducing, we need to pitch the nose up slightly to maintain our altitude, and then once the speed gets below 250 and we hit the end of base, we can start deploying our flaps 20 degrees. Then we have to account for the pitching up of the nose when we deploy our flaps, so we pitch down slightly so we don't gain any extra altitude. Our speed continues to drop off, and we should level off at our approach speed of between 2 to 220 km an hour. So now we're at the end of downwind, we're getting ready to turn base, so we look out our left shoulder, we make sure the runway is at 45 degrees between the wing and the tail, and that is when we begin to turn base. Alright, that's about the right point, begin to turn base. On base we'll be starting your descent, and you can deploy the next degrees of flaps that you want. On base you can roll the wings level and check for traffic if you want, but I know there is no traffic, so I'm just going to continue my turn. And coming on to final, you want to remember that the throttle controls your descent rate and your pitch controls your airspeed. So by adjusting these two things, you can keep the runway in the same spot on your windscreen as you approach. As we're rolling on to final, quick check of the speed. Speed's looking good. I don't think I'm going to need the last 20 degrees of flaps, so I'm just going to continue my approach. If I was on a full flaps approach, it would appear more steep. As I'm coming in on final, I'm only making minor adjustments to bring myself back on the centre. Starting to close in on the runway. And you pitch back a little bit for the flare. And I'm going to go for a wheels landing, so I'm just going to pull back a little bit more, wait for the touchdown at near zero descent rate. On touchdown you can do full back pressure if you want, but that tends to cause a lot of bouncing. So just hold enough back pressure to keep the tail on the ground without it bouncing while applying brakes. Now ideally you want to use the whole runway to slow down, and that way you can get onto the taxiway as soon as possible and avoid any aircraft that may be coming in for landing. That's the familiarization video for the LaGG-3 Series 29.